Today we're going to analyze the anatomy of a fountain pen, and we're going to check all the terms used to describe each single element. Hey Goodfellas, I'm Naldi and we are at Style of Zug. When it comes to pens or fountain pens, you might have heard different terms to describe certain elements, or sometimes you might even be in difficulty when it comes to actually define a specific section and give it a name. Well, I would say let's make this video a base for each one of us to exactly know what we're talking about when we are describing a specific element of a fountain pen, so we know exactly which terms to use. And to do that, I'm going to bring you over here and we're going to check out the fountain pens directly. So let's immediately start defining what the simpler terms for such a fountain pen are. This is what we call here a barrel, this is what we call a cap, and what we have here is a clip. This part here, just from here to here, is what we call the body. So let's say if you have a scratch here and you want to tell your retailer that there is a scratch on this surface, you're going to say, okay, there is a scratch on the body. If the scratch is here on the back, this is what we call the finial, okay? So if you have any damage on this below part of the pen, this is what you're going to call a finial. This is a ring or a trim ring, you call it as you prefer. Then this here, where you close down the cap on it, is a thread. When there's a little, you see, there's a little step between the body and the thread, and you call that actually a step. So it's a step between the thread and the body. Then this part here is the grip section. Some also just call it section, but I would definitely call it a grip section. That's where you grip your pen to actually write with your wonderful fountain pen. Then if you have a cartridge converter, then this piece here that you can actually use to fill up the ink from an ink bottle, while this being also a piece that you can use with a cartridge, is called converter. The one of you who are big into it know exactly that this is a converter. Some of the newer one might find this terminology very useful to know. Let's go over to what we call a piston fountain pen. There is a few elements that you might find on a piston filling fountain pen. Like for example, on this 149, you see what you have here? This is a so-called ink window. Now you could call this also a shuttered ink window, because you can see it's not completely transparent, but there's a mix between transparent and non-transparent elements. So this is an ink window. In this case, this is a shuttered ink window. The finial, since this is also the piece that you use to action the piston filling mechanism, I call this the piston knob. So then if we go one step further, this element here that you usually find underneath the nib is what we call a feed. The feed can be made in plastic, or it can be made like on a Delta or on a Montegrappa in ebonite. Now let me tell you, before we move on to the definition of the several elements of the feed, the difference between an ebonite feed and the plastic feed is that a plastic feed, you engineer it once, and once it's engineered, you inject it, and each single feed comes out exactly the same. So it's definitely less handmade work, but it guarantees that the feed will always work in the same way. While with the ebonite feed, being a material that lives much more and moves more, there's much more handmade precision required, and therefore there are very few pens and really more the handmade brands that actually decide to go for an ebonite feed, just like Montegrappa or Delta. Now, what you can see here is that an ebonite feed being cut with a CNC machine machine from an ebonite barrel requires an incredible precision in order to cut each single fin in a very, very precise way. Otherwise, the ink flow will not be guaranteed or as good as it's supposed to be and as we expect from a fine fountain pen. Now, this element here is obviously what we call a nib. In this case, we're talking about a Sailor 21 karat gold nib. And now let me tell you about an interesting terms for a feed. What we have here is the upper part of the feed is called wings. These two elements actually look like wings. Then we have these elements here on both sides, left and right. I already mentioned it. It's called fins. What you see in the middle here, going all from the upper part all down, is what is called an ink channel. Okay, so that's where the ink actually starts from here, from the post. That's where you also put the cartridge in. When you put this back here, okay, so wait a second, let me put it correctly. It's gonna be probably like that, okay? So this is where you're gonna put in the converter or the cartridge, and this is called the post. So actually the ink starts flowing from here, and you can see that there is a very thin cut in the post. And actually when they do the post in ebonite, that's the biggest nightmare. So Delta actually creates this post too, and to actually do that, you know how many breaks since it's handmade. So this is also an indicator of great care and craftsmanship and no compromise from a brand like Delta, for example. And so the ink starts here and flows all the way up. It's being stored in the fins, left and right. So that's why also when you're actually leaving your fountain pen for a few weeks, that's where the ink will remain stored. And hopefully if it has a great ink flow and everything, then it will immediately start writing when you put the nib on paper. Then if we go to the nib, which I've just mentioned very briefly. So this part below here is what we call a base. This part here is the body, and you have the imprint on the body. Then the little hole here before the split starts is called a breather hole. So it gives actually to the nib that is connected with the feed the right amount of breathing of air in order for the ink to flow freely. Then this is what we call a slit. So we have the left slit and the right slit. On the top we have the tipping material, which is usually in iridium or a material that is similar to iridium. And this part here on the sides is what we call shoulders. So it makes sense. We have the slit, the shoulder, the breather hole. This is the body. We have the base of the nib. We have the tipping material. These are the tines. So if there is a misalignment on the upper part, you're going to say there is a misalignment of the tines. If you have any kind of other problem, then you know exactly which terms you can use. And so guys, fellas, I hope that this video was very useful to you. It was very useful to me too. I think it's very important that we know the terms of the item that we love so much, and it gives us the chance to really describe the beauty of such an item, or even the problems or the solutions to solve any kind of issues with our fountain pens in the best possible way, and to have the best kind of communication in order to really cherish our passion. Let me know if this content was useful to you. Stay tuned for more content that is coming up in the next days. And as usual, don't forget that together we are changing the game.